Okay. So I don't need to do anything. Okay. Good evening and thank you for joining, both in person and online. If I could ask those who are here in person, if you ask any questions, please ask loudly so that the participants online can enjoy the questions. Um, I will also share. We have some handouts which I'm going to share online when we go through them. But what I want to start with, I think the topic we're talking about is whether we should be allowing hindquarters. Um, is one of those topics which I think has a whole range of issues, whether both halacha, history, and what some may call politics. I remember when I was studying for smicha, my Rosh Kollel said to me that when it comes to any halachic matter, the ratio you should expect, if you think the ratio, if you think a question as a rabbi of a community is 100% halacha and no politics and no communal issues, so going into the rabbinate is the wrong rule for you. He says, and if there's an issue where 80% of the issue, 70%, 6% of the issue is politics and not halacha, that's not for you either. It's the bits in the middle. It's those areas that have a mixture of halacha, history, politics, and we'll define politics as well. I don't mean party politics. I mean communal issues that you have to take into account when making decisions. And we have some more of these. But I do want to start, so I will show on the screen. Once we get this started, there's been much more. So for some reason that screen has gone. Give me one moment, please. So while you're waiting those here, you can read the JC from 1864 on the back and see if you recognize any of the births or the deaths on there. That's the activity. When we show it online, we'll see if we can get that as well. But we're going to show just the top of page. No, that's not sharing. There we go. It says it. Is it sharing? You can see it sharing. Okay. I think where I'd like to start on this, and what I want to cover this evening, I think one of the most important things I'm going to show is actually a response written by the Srida H. Rabbi Yaakov Weinberg, who was the rabbi in Berlin prior to the Second World War. He was there. He was the Rav of Berlin when the Nazi Party, Machshon, took over, and what he had to deal with is a paradigm of how it gives an amazing paradigm of how Rabbonim should look at issues. We're also going to look at the specific issue of hindquarters as well. So I would like to dispel a couple of myths to start with. When I first started to look at this, and thank my cousin, Shimon Cohen, who is the world expert in protecting shechita and many other things that he does for the community. So a public thanks to you, Shimon, for all you do. But particularly for this evening, what you've done for Shechita UK, and not only in the UK, but across Europe and elsewhere, making sure that Shechita is protected and allowed in this country, because we know there are lots of people who are not with us on many issues. And I'm trying to be delicate, it's being recorded. And so when I first started to discuss this issue with Shimon, there was the labeling crisis had just started, and that's where people were advocating that everything that had any animal that had been killed through shechita should have a label on it that that it had been shechted through kosher means, or whatever, however they wanted to describe it. And a problem, if that would have gone through, is that it would be very difficult to sell the bits of the animal that we can't eat and we don't want into the non-kosher market. And we see it throughout the response, throughout the generations, that in all, except for Israel, in all countries, and even in Israel in part, but every country we've lived in, we sell the bits of the animal we don't use to the non-kosher market. And without that, the prices of our meat would be through the roof. And bear in mind that for every herd that we shecht the animals of, the percentages of kosher animals is, well, last time I checked this, was somewhere between 55 and 65%, which means it's lower than that. It's got to be above 50%. Because if you get below 50%, then you get to the question that Rav Hershel Schachter, the Rosh Hashiva of YU, asks, although you do about milk. How do we know that milk is kosher? What do you need for milk to be kosher? What do you need for it to be kosher? It needs to come from a kosher animal. And how do you know the animal is kosher? So you take it from a cow. I mean, this is not talking about chalav Yisrael, chalav so. We're not talking about you have witnessed it came from a cow. How do you know that cow is kosher? Because if more than 50% of the animals that we're shechting are not kosher, or are found because they've got whatever lesions in the lungs, or they've got other injuries that cause it to be considered a treifa, then you lose that. We rely on rove. We rely on the fact that the majority of animals, the majority of cows are kosher. But if you've got a herd where the majority of cows are not kosher, then that could create a problem with the kashrus of the milk. And I remember when Rav Hershel Schachter came to see Rav Moshe Sternbuch, the Av Bezdin of the Eder Charedis in Yerushalayim, Diane Ehrentreu's brother-in-law, and he was trying to say to him that we should be banning milk. He argued with him and didn't. But I have a lovely story. A friend of mine was making Sheva Brachos in New York, and the Schechters came to the Sheva Brachos, and it was in a milky restaurant. So Rav Shechter already had a question about the Sheva Brachos to start with. But when it came to dessert, Rabbi Shechter said, and it was going to be cake and ice cream, Rabbi Shechter said to the waiter, says, when you bring out the dessert, please note that my husband doesn't have milky ice cream. So when they brought out desserts, they brought out 2 plates just with cake and no ice cream, and gave the rabbi and the Rebbetzin the cake without the ice cream, and the Rebbetzin objects. I said, my husband doesn't have the milky ice cream, but I would like it, thank you very much. So we have to bear in mind a large percentage, let's call it a large percentage, of the animals that we shecht in a shecht house are already not kosher. So let's say it's 45%. So 45% of 45% of the entire stock one has to get rid of and sell to the non-kosher market. So it's a 40 to 45% loss even before we discuss the hindquarters. When we talk about the hindquarters, we can't eat the whole part of the back part of the animal. We're going to go through the halacha of it, that it has to be porged. It has to be, in Yiddish, the word is trebring. In Hebrew, we would say to be menaker. And in English, in fact, Microsoft Word doesn't like this word because it keeps pulling up as a spelling mistake, but because it doesn't have the word in its vocabulary. But porging, you lose 16% of the back due to porging. And so already you have to sell a lot. And there is this myth going around that if we were to serve hindquarters, it would make things financially far more viable. I think the opposite happens to be true, because firstly, if it is allowed, you need top experts to do it, and it's labor intensive, and it also, pun really not intended, it really kills the meat. So a lot of it becomes out very stringy, and so that's non-sellable as well. The second myth, and Shimon, please jump in at any point. So the second myth is that you can get it in abundance elsewhere. You can get it in Israel, but a lot of people think that in New York, you go into a nice steakhouse and that's what they offer. Because when I first looked into this, in America, they have different trading standards to us. And so they advertise that they have filet mignon being sold in their restaurant when it's not a filet mignon. And now that's why this source 3, which I'm going to scroll down here on the screen, if I can find it. If you look at source 3, I've got to get it up elsewhere. Here we go. So actually, I'm going to show source 1, there isn't a source. Well, I'm going to show source one, which says, Jose pointing to a large piece of meat. This is the mother cut, the ribeye. Most of the cuts we offer come from that. Dominique is able to take away the fat and creates this, points to another piece of very lean looking rare red meat. There is no real filet mignon in the kosher world because kosher butchers can only use meat from the rib to the neck of the animal. So we needed to create a cut that resembled the filet. And that was the owner of Le Marais restaurant. And then if you look at the menu in reserve cut, I hope you could see this. This is a 14-ounce reserve cut ribeye, and now filet mignon is in speech marks. So they've had to change it because I guess in America they've changed their.
Which part is filet mignon in there?
So we look at so if you look at those animals at the top, you see the hind quarter starts on the British cuts, the sirloin and the flank, and the filet mignon is taken from part of that top part there. In somewhere, but I think it's part of the sirloin. But that's so there is that they're also in. People often say as well they go to Paris and have different cuts of meat. I think you can get sweetbreads in Paris. Anyone had sweetbreads? But that's crated veal, which is illegal in this country. And Rav Moshe Feinstein actually has a tshuva whether it's permitted to eat, whether crated veal. But as with foie gras, there are certain things that the EU bans, but because they are special dishes in France, they're allowed to prepare them in France. And so that's why the only foie gras I think you can get in Europe is from France, and the foie gras that's sold in Kosher Kingdom is all from France. So the two things is, number one, it wouldn't solve a financial crisis. It wouldn't make meat cheaper, or contraire. And the second is the myth that you can get it. You can get it in Israel. You can get it in Israel. There are restaurants that sell it. And I did check this with Diane Zobin before presenting the show, because I often ask the question, if you go to a restaurant in Israel that serves hindquarters and it's got a good hechsher, are we as Ashkenazim, but the question is asked because it's assumed that only Sephardim eat hindquarters, can we as Ashkenazim eat in that restaurant? And I asked this question to Rav Moshe Sternbuch, again, the Avbetin of the Eder Charedis, and he said, if you know it's a good hechsher, then it's fine. And Diane Zobin confirmed to me that that is his ruling as well, because I wouldn't paskin in somebody else's shul. But you would need, if you find such a place, you would need to check with him whether he's comfortable with the hechsher. Interesting enough, it's a different question were there to be a restaurant in the UK that served hindquarters, because in Eretz Yisrael, in Israel, the minhag is to allow it, and therefore you're not breaking any policy by eating hindquarters if it's got a good hechsher. Whereas there is a debate amongst the Achronim what to do if you're in Chutzros, you're in America, or in London, where the minhag is not to serve hindquarters, whether if there is hindquarters that's served with a good hechsher, whether you're allowed, and we'll come to that. Going back a step, so we're going to just give some background. Actually, before I do that, I'm going to show on the screen source 4. You've got it. Those are here. It's on page 3. It's actually, sorry, it's source 5. It's printed as source 5 here. And as I mentioned before, the Srida H. Rabbi Yaakov Weinberg, who was the Rav of Berlin, was faced with the following quandary. And this is what's called pressure. This is what's called being placed in a situation where you have to, where there are no right answers and certainly no easy answers. And I'll translate it. This is source 5. This is the Srida H. And the phrase Srida H means remnants of the fire. He's a Holocaust survivor. He's referring to, and some of his papers were saved by one of his Talmidim, one of his students, and this is them. So he writes as follows: I wrote this essay at a time of unbelievable pressure. At a time, and you'll hear the puns, hear the rabbinic puns, at a time when a very sharp blade was placed on the neck of the Jewish people. Hamalchus harisha shel hanatzim, the wicked Nazi government, Gozra Issa al Shchita Belohimim Habahima Kotim Shchitoso. They ruled that it was forbidden to shecht an animal without pre-stunning it. This is where the question, I believe, first came up. This question doesn't actually, just historically, doesn't last very long because it wasn't long before the Nazis just banned everything. But this is at the beginning, and it's fascinating to see the papers around this, but it's at the beginning when the Nazi Party have just taken over. And the question is, because many Jews voted for the Nazi Party, I remember writing that in a piece of history coursework, and I dropped marks. Because, not that it's still bothering me some years on. I dropped marks for this because the teacher said there is no way that any Jews voted for the Nazi Party, but they did, and we have historical evidence. I mean, you have to go too far or too far back to see how 33% of New York's Jews voted for an anti-Semite state. Anyway, but there in 1933 Germany, they're faced between the communists and the Nazis, and it's like, who's worse? It's not who's good for the Jews, it's who's less bad. And so this is in a very short period at the beginning of Nazi rule when these questions could be asked. But still, we knew they were a wicked government. And after that, this wicked government played all sorts of horrible games with us. And they banned Esav Sharos Lahavi Bosam and Achutz. They didn't let us bring in meat from outside of Germany. And they didn't allow a regular shchita, a kosher shchita, even for old people and people who were desperately ill, who needed meat to sustain them. We saw that there was a great danger because many Jews wouldn't stand up to this test, God forbid, and they would end up, because they want to eat meat, they need to eat meat, they're going to eat treif. So on one side of the thing, he's being asked to do something that's forbidden. It seems to be forbidden. And on the other hand, if he doesn't try and find a solution, then people are going to eat treif. Perhaps that's similar to the question we had 2 weeks ago with Rabbi Tuvia Geffen in 2 years later, but in Atlanta in very different circumstances, when he was trying to see what he could do to allow Coke, which had animal-based glycerin in it at the time. To point out for those who weren't here, at the time, it doesn't have animal-based glycerin anymore. Continuing the second paragraph here, Ben Taim, in the meanwhile, Nishma HaKol, the voice went out, Ki Shilton HaKehillah HaIvris HaGadolah Berlin, I guess the equivalent of the political Jewish leadership in Berlin. They wanted to sustain the various Jewish communal buildings. Can't imagine this happening. Beit HaCholem, there's a Jewish hospital. Batei Moshav Skanim, the old age homes for Oid. Achilas Bosa Nevela Trefa Hanikna b'Makulim Shanachrim. They wanted to serve meat that was treif that was bought from treifa butchers. That's what the Jewish communal leadership body wanted to do, not an Orthodox body, but a cross-communal wanted to provide. So Shilton HaKehillah, the leadership of the Kehillah, Sha'afal Pi Shahurkov Beruba Hagodol Manoshim Liberalium, even though it was most of them were not Orthodox. Up to now, they had always been respectful and had always made sure that the old age homes and the hospitals and whatever it is kept to al pi chukei haShulchan Aruch. They would keep to the laws of Shulchan Aruch. And they would make sure that they followed the religious leadership in what was allowed in these places. Ta'an, but they claimed, at time of such difficulty, their hand is forced, they have to allow this. They have to allow treif. Because of the threat to life for the ill people and the elderly. I think now medicine might have moved on a bit. We might not have claimed that to have your short ribs for Shabbos lunch is a matter of life and death. One could argue. Sha'al pi Pekudas Harofaim, they obviously hadn't, I mean, different times, but they hadn't discovered power of Cholent. So that's the Sha'al P Pekudas Harofaim, because according to the ruling, the guidance of the doctors, according to the doctors of 1930s Berlin, it is impossible to exist without eating meat. That's what they said. Shmuel Zeh Pogat Banafshein, and the Srida Eish writes, he writes, this caused an unbelievable damage to our souls. To hear this, that this is what the Jewish communal body are going to serve. What do I do now as the Rabbi of Berlin? There's a toughie. There's a tough one. But we're not going to see. He wrote 30 pages on this. So, but with just one last paragraph to see how he went about it. Batzalonu Gamarnu Lehimalech Gedoli Lita of Poland. So we decided that we were going to consult with the Gedolim of Lithuania and Poland. Because of the situation we're in Berlin, in 1933, because of the danger to life, because of the Nazis, whether we would find a way to allow pre-stunning. Nasati Vilna, I traveled to Vilna, Levarsha to Warsaw, Ulu Lublin and to Lublin, Lesham lehisyatzes b'sheila chamor zu hanagos nefesh hayahadus begamarnia, to ask this very serious question that were related to the whole of Judaism in Germany. Haga'onim, the great leaders, Moron Reb Chaim Ozer Grudzinski Zatzal, the famous great leader of Lithuanian Jewry, Reb Chaim Ozer Grudzinski, Rav Meir Shapira Belublin, I mean, these are giants. They asked me to write up this question in halacha, and that's where we're going to leave this question. If I give another thought, then we'll come back to this question to see what happens. But just to give a sense of if we want to give like a first-person account of how difficult questions can be given the circumstances in which we live, and not only because of the political situation, but also because of the Jewish leadership and the challenges. And so these are, it's very powerful. And I mean, I think, just to share that Reb Chaim Ozer said, even in such circumstances, you can't allow pre-stunning because there's no way of doing it. He goes to the whole thing. He tried to find a way of doing a pre-stunning that doesn't cause any damage to the animal and makes it still be sentient and all that. There's a lot of work that was done, but Reb Chaim Ozer, if I remember correctly, didn't like it. And if he doesn't allow it in such circumstances, that's something that we can't entertain. So that's the background, and there have been discussions about pre-stunning since that have come up in different times. So let's, where am I going to go on the sheet? Just get it right in front of us. So we need to know the background to hindquarters. In ancient times, well, not ancient times, it was going back 1,000 years, the Chinese had different names for Muslims, Jews, and Christians. And they would be called, and I don't know how to pronounce it, so I'm not going to pretend to, but I wrote it down in English. It was Hui. And Huai, I think it's pronounced. Christians were called Huai, who abstain from animals without the cloven foot. Muslims were called Huai, who abstain from pork. And Jews were called Huai, who extract the sinews. So this is something we've been known as for a very, very long time. And the basis of this, we know the story in Parshas Vayishlach, where Yaakov Avinu, where Jacob is challenged, but he goes over the river overnight and he has a fight with Esav's guardian angel, and there, before morning, he hits him on the thigh, and at that point we are taught there's a halacha that we can't eat what is called the gid hanasha, the sciatic nerve, and it's a very grave sin in Judaism. It's got a chiyuv of kores, and so to eat that part of the animal where the sciatic nerve is, that it has to be removed. In the hindquarters and in the forequarters, one should be aware of, there are also forbidden fats. There are also forbidden fats, And so we do actually, if people say we don't porge animals, that's a misnomer. We do porge animals. We porge the forequarters. The forequarters of the animal, but it's much less labor intensive and it's much less complicated. The positioning and the amount of chalev, of fat, forbidden fats in the front part of the animal than in the back part of the animal. And I think it's quite interesting to see, firstly, and sorry for the order, I did do the sheets and then changed how I was going to present it. But we see the Sefer HaChinuch, which is in source 3, and the Sefer HaChinuch, which is a Sefer that was written in Barcelona. It's written anonymously in the 12th century in Barcelona, where a father wanted to write something to keep his son entertained on a Shabbos afternoon. So he wrote him the Sefer, which goes through every mitzvah in the Torah according to the weekly Sedra. And he lists the basic halachas, but also gives reasons, potential reasons for the mitzvah. And here, when it comes to Gid Hanasha, why are we not allowed to eat the Gid Hanasha? And he writes, and I'll read this in English, to remind us that even though the Jewish people will suffer many troubles and exile at the hands of the nations and the hands of the children of Esau, they should be confident they will not be lost. Their children, their name will endure forever, and the Redeemer will come for them and redeem them from oppression. When they remember this idea through this commandment, they will be steadfast in their faith and their righteousness forever. This reminder is because the Malach, the angel who rested with Yaakov, was, according to our tradition, the guardian angel of Esau, and he wished to destroy Yaakov from this world, he and his seed, but he could not do so. But he wounded him by touching his calf. So too the children of Esau will wound the children of Yaakov, but in the end they will be saved from them, as we see that the sun shone on Yaakov to heal him, and he was saved from the wound. So will the Son of Mashiach shine on us and heal us from our pain and exile. Amen b'mheira v'yameinu. And Rav Shimshon Raphael Hirsch adds this. This is not on the sheet. He writes, by having to remove the Gid Hanasha, whenever Yaakov's descendants sit down to eat meat, they realize that their continued existence is not dependent on their physical strength and stamina, but on spiritual factors which can never be weakened by Esau's might. And so there's a real powerful lesson about our time in exile by knowing that we don't eat the Gid Hanasha, and when we eat meat, we remind ourselves of that. Okay.
Just to check, and the
Please.
is saying that not only that you should remove the Gid Hanasha, but that we should be mindful when we're eating meat that we are not eating Gid Hanasha, and this symbolism is all very kind of pertinent.
Yes, but both the Sefer Chinuch and Rav Shimshon Raphael Hirsch are saying that, and you see that that is something we did, removing the sciatic nerve, removing the Gid Hanasha. So did something change or did it not change? And that's what in the second half of the shit we're going to be looking at. But that's the background. That's where the Isser, the prohibition on eating the Gid Hanasha comes from. The Isser of eating chalev are throughout where it's in Perek Gimel of Sefer Vayikra, where we learn about the chalev that we can't have, and that has to be removed. Interesting, the Ramban at Nachmanides says in Vayikra Perek Gimel Posuk Tes, the term chalev refers to fat that is separate and not together with the meat as one thing. The fat that is mixed in with the meat and not separated from it is called shuman, but chalev is separated with a surrounding membrane and can be peeled off. So, and the interest of the chalev is what's forbidden, and the shuman is permitted. That's permitted fat. And so, when you have a fatty piece of meat, that fat is not chalev. That is the shuman which is permitted. The permitted fats. As we said, there's chalev on some of the forequarters, such as the white fat on the bottom of the liver, but the primary task in nikkor of the forequarters of the porging is removing several blood vessels. And let's talk about the nikkor, the porging, the trabering of the hindquarters, and let's hear some of the poskim and talk about some of the history and the halacha. One thing I forgot to mention: there is, or there at least used to be, one difference between meat that how our poskim paskin here and how the poskim paskin in America about how far back in the animal you can go. It's a machlokas between the Noidib Yehuda and the Chasam Sofer of where the hindquarters starts. And so we go up to the 11th rib in the UK, I believe, and in the States, in some places, they go up to the 13th rib. But coming back, so the Ramor, Rav Moshe Isser's, our primary Ashkenazi source in Yeridea, Simon Samach Dalad, and again in Simon Samach Hey, points out that Nikah cannot be learnt from a text. You can't just sit and learn the Shulchan Aruch. You have to. It can only be learnt through apprenticeship. And going back, the Mishnah in Chulin refers to a dispute amongst Tanoim whether observant butchers can be trusted to remove the Gid Hanosha and forbidden fats. Rav Meir contending that we cannot trust them since removing them is highly tedious. Instead, according to Rav Meir, someone else must double check after the menachah is finished to see that the trebering was performed correctly. It's so difficult, it's so time consuming, and it needs such expertise that you need a second person to oversee it. And you can imagine, if we're thinking in terms of costs, what that means. Now, interestingly, the halacha does not follow Rav Meir's opinion, and technically one may rely on a trained Yirei Shamayim, God-fearing person to do the job properly. But in many cases, in many cities where they did allow trebering, porging, they were machmeh like Rav Meir to always have a second person. If you can read the JC here on page 4. And so I don't normally quote the Jewish Chronicle in a shir, but I think it was okay. Well, was it okay in 1864? We'll find out. So if you took at the top left, let's see what we can do here. Firstly, the births, Mazel Tov to family Russell. Then the tragedy, some deaths. Plymouth congregation wants a competent chazan, teacher, and secretary. I think it might be too late to apply for that job. Then there's Hull congregation and the Bristol congregation, and they're looking for a Bal Korah and chazan. Whereas Hull wants the competent English and Hebrew teacher. If you go down on the left-hand side, it says, Board for the Affairs of the Shechita. Notice is hereby given that the Board of Ecclesiastical Administration has issued instructions that in future the hindquarters of kosher beef, veal, and mutton shall be sealed only after they have been duly porged, when the seal of the board will then be attached to them. The Jewish community are therefore cautioned not to receive from their butchers any hindquarters, in brackets, namely loins of beef, loins of veal, legs, loins, and saddles of mutton, without such seal being affixed, as otherwise they must be considered treifa, not slain, and searched according to law. And that's the secretary of the Board of Shechita, Tammuz 5624, which is 1864. And then there's the middle column is an appeal, and you can look at that. You can enjoy that in your own time and see how much they needed to raise. And it actually says how much. I love the fact, I'm going to get distracted. The bottom of the middle column, where it talks about the following contributions have already been received, and it says how much the chief rabbi donated to the cause, and then the Baron and Baroness Lionel de Rothschild, per the Reverend Dr. Adler, gave a significant amount more than him. Fascinating. Anyway, that's not necessarily our topics. You see, in 1864, at least in England, hindquarters was being served. So, again, in many places, the custom developed, and it's not, I should point out another thing, it's not an Ashkenaz Sephardi thing. It's not an Ashkenazi Sephardi thing. In fact, the earliest source that I found that mentions this practice is a tshuva of the Radvaz, who was the chief rabbi of Egypt almost 500 years ago. And he'd been asked about the local custom to slaughter on the eastern side of a building, which was apparently a Muslim custom at the time. The question was whether this practice violates halacha, since it seems to be copying a practice of another religion. Is this called chukas hagoy? The Radvaz rules that one may slaughter on the eastern side, since there was nothing idolatrous about this practice. One of his reasons is that the Jews only used the forequarters and left the hindquarters, plus the non-kosher slaughtered animals, as we discussed before. These were then sold to the Muslims, who would then not eat them unless they were slaughtered on the eastern side. And so the Radvaza proved the practice not to trade with the hindquarters, since expert menachrim are hard to find. So you see already, 500 years ago in Egypt, the general practice was to firstly shecht in a way that the non-Jewish population would be happy to buy it, and so that we could have that 40%, well, however much of the animals it turns out we could have, and make it financially viable. But porging hindquarters wasn't an option because we didn't have the expert. There were, however, many cities in Europe where nickel was practiced. The Noda B'Yehuda of Yecheskel Landau notes that in Prague it was practiced, but it also points out there were cities in which there were no trained menachrim, and therefore it was not practiced there. Rabbi Yonasan Eibershitz, whose grave I have been to visit in Hamburg. It was called Altona. He was the Rav in Altona, but actually now Altona. I went to Hamburg, I looked where is Altona. It's actually a suburb of Hamburg nowadays, and he's buried there. Interesting enough, just 4 kavarim away from Rabbi Yaakov Emden, who was his great adversary. And at the end of their life, thanks to Pesach of the Noda B'Yehuda, were buried together. Fascinating story for another time. He himself, Rabbi Yonasan Eibershitz, was a master menacher who, in his famous work, The Crazy or Placey, he writes that he only eats hindquarters if he himself he didn't trust anyone else. Only if he would do it, would he do it. And the Yeshua's Yaakov testifies that in all big cities such as his, and he came from Lviv, as well as in Brot and Krakow, Nikah was performed. And it seems there was a change in the late 19th century, at least for those who did allow out up to that point. There were many that didn't. Rabbi Chil Michal Epstein, the Aruch HaShulchan, one of the most important halachis of the last 150 years, says, and he came from Novardok. He was the Rav in the famous town of Novardok, Novogrudok as it's called in Belarusian. He explains that in his town, Nikah was under strict rabbinical control, performed not by the butchers, but rather by specially trained and licensed menachrim. As a further safeguard, the rabbis banned the importation of meat from outside the city. But he also notes that even within the city, most parts of the town didn't allow Nikah because the complications of it and the grave seriousness if you get it wrong. And as you go through the 19th century, Rav Shimshon Raphael Hirsch wrote to the Av Beis Din of Prague that one should not relax the custom already established by our fathers and grandfathers to refrain from the practice of trabeling. And so for many places, it was already not allowed. And although in some places through the 20th century, it became, in Ashkenazi community, it became the exception, not the rule. And then we need to talk about London. So that's Europe. What about England? And primarily we'll talk about London, although Glasgow does get a mention soon. I'm going to scroll up because if you go back to source number 4, it's number 2. The sourcing numbers went wrong. Number 6, top of page 2, we have in 1614, Rabbi Leon Modena, a well-known Phoenician rabbi, was commissioned by an English lord to write a description of Jewish practices for King James I. His work, published in 1637, which, as everyone knows, is after the death of King James I. He died in 1625. It was published in 1637 in Italian, and forgive my pronunciation, but Historia digli Riti Hebraici was the first description of Jewish ritual written by a Jew in the vernacular, explicitly for a non-Jewish audience. And he writes, whence it is that in many places in Italy, this is a translation by the way, this is not my Italian, that in many places in Italy and in Germany especially, they do not eat the hindquarters because this sinew, gid hanosha, is in them, and a great deal of fat, which requires much exactness to be taken away clean, and there are but few that can do it as it should be. So that this is before the Jewish community moved back. So from 1656, when the Jewish community started, until 1827, it wasn't allowed, and it was first introduced by the London Board of Schrieta in 1827. But at that time, it's reported that housewives, that's the language that's used, were not happy with the appearance of the porch meat and complained to the board. And the following description is from Albert Hyamson's The London Board of Schrieta, 1804 to 1954. Huh? No, I've got this on my notes. I haven't printed this out, but this is the book. The name of the book, the booklet, is the London Board of Schrieta, 1804. Sounds like, sorry, it did sound like I was auditioning for Mastermind. Your expert topic, the London Board of Schrieta, 1804 to 1954. Your 2 minutes starts now. In 1865, this is him writing, the tension between the board, the butchers, and the housewives really reached such levels that a representative was sent to observe the methods of Nico practiced in Leghorn, Italy, also known as Livorno. I should point out, if I'm allowed to hit, there is a Highgate shul trip to Tuscany on the 10th and 11th of May next year, where one of the cities we'll be going to is Livorno, to Leghorn, just saying. And so representatives were sent to observe the methods of Nico practiced in Leghorn and in Paris, in the hopes that Nico was done there in a neater manner. Unfortunately, there was no differences in the methods. The conflict between the housewives, the butchers, and the board continued for decades. Eventually, the board licensed only certain butchers to sell hindquarters. This led to other problems, and in 1912 and again in 1923, special campaigns were initiated to educate the public about the importance of Nicker and to enforce the regulations. Sometime after 1929, the Basin of the board prohibited the sale of hindquarters, though some Nicker apparently continued in London until 1941. But in 1941, Dina Bramsky, Rabbi Cheskel Bramsky, supported Rabbi Yomin Banish Atlas of Glasgow, there you go, in rejecting the butcher's request to sell hindquarters. His concern that it could lead to problems of supervision, and I believe that is the last time that Nico Acharayim, the porging of the hindquarters, was allowed in this country. And as I've explained, well, partly explained, when people are calling for about, it's not financially helpful, and would change the dynamic in the abattoirs tremendously, given that we sell the hindquarters cheap, so they would take the forequarters at better prices. There's lots in terms of the finance that it doesn't work, but the main issues here are halachic in terms of how can we, it's so, and the prices as well, because it's so complicated, how can it be done and done in a way that we can be satisfied and confident that it's kosher? Doing it, if you're talking about you're living in a little shtetl and there's one cow that's shechted a year and you've got the time to be able to do that. But now that we work with industrialized shechita, that was a phrase that Shimon taught me, industrialized shechita, to do things on that scale, the number of people and the slowing down of everything it would take is almost impossible. And so the answer to the question, we should not be allowing hindquarters. But as I said, if you go to Israel and find a good hechsher that serves it, and check with your local Orthodox rabbi whether what a good hechsher there is, enjoy it. Now, what about Israel? Because let's give some background to Israel. For many years, Sephardim were the majority in Yerushalayim, since the modern community was established by Jews expelled during the Spanish expulsion. Sephardim slaughtered only goats and sheep, on which they practiced nicker of the forequarters, but nicker of the hindquarters was not done because of the animal's small size. Following, and now we turn to the 18th century, the arrival of the students of the Vilna Gaon, and at the same time the students of the Baal Shem Tov, this is the beginning of the 19th century, the Ashkenazi community grew. And at that time there was a problem because the Turks didn't allow the Ashkenazi community to do its own shechita. Another story for another time as well. Finally, in 1874, the Ashkenazi community was granted the right to have its own shechita. It continued to follow the practice of the Sephardic communities and only perform nicker on the forequarters of goats and sheep. And that's why, just parenthetically, Yerushalmi Ashkenazim do porging on the forequarters in a different way to Ashkenazim elsewhere in the world. You may never know when that piece of information will become useful to show off. But
So Nico and Portugal then is relevant to more numbers than just actually beef.
yes,
Physically, but so
Yeah.
lamb as well.
yeah. And you heard from that list of bits of meat that we could have in 1865, 1864, that was, where was it? The loins and saddles of mutton. In 1876, the Ashkenazim in Yerushalayim initiated kosher slaughter of cattle, and also introduced Nikor Acharayim, porging hindquarters, based on the practices of their ancestors. And the following year, Rabbi Shua Leib Diskin of Brisk, an expert Menachem, moved to Yerushalayim, and together with Rabbi Shmuel Salant, established a Vada Shrita to ensure that the Shrita and Nikor were performed in the strictest manner. And it's not the main practice anymore in Israel. Most Shritas don't do it, but there are some that do, and some of them doing it in a very small manner just to preserve the Masorah, the tradition, so that from generation to generation it's not lost of how to do this extremely complex method. One more piece of history is that the issue of Nikor came up again in 1938, and we mentioned Reb Chaim Ozer Grudzinski before, ruling in 1933 about pre-stunning. He was asked in 1938 because by the start of the Second World War and the Shoah, Jews in most parts of Poland no longer did Nikor, and the Polish government, the Polish parliament, passed legislation forbidding the sale of kosher slaughtered meat to non-Jews. So that immediately creates all sorts of havoc. So now you have all the animals. You can't do anything with the tray for animals because you can't eat them. But what do we do about hindquarters that we can't shift? That was the question. And given that the animals there, the prices are through the roof already. So Reb Chaim Ozer Grudzinski wrote that in a rabbinic meeting held in Warsaw, it was ruled that all Polish Jewish communities, without exception, should immediately reintroduce the practice of Nikor Acharayim to avoid significant financial loss to the Jewish population. And he pointed out at that time that it wasn't an established custom that we don't do it. We've just made a decision that because of our lack of ability to oversee the process appropriately, we don't allow it. Rather than saying, this is the minhag here, this is the tradition here, and therefore we'd be able to bring it back in extremis when we couldn't sell it to the thing, and given that we're in a war situation. So that's an extreme example. But for the rest of the time, it seems that the main practice in big communities is not to allow it. Again, a number of reasons, primarily because it's so difficult to oversee and to get it right, labor intensive, and even when you do it, you have to. Much of the meat is not great, and the financial implications of it are also crippling. I'm just looking if I've gone through this. So there's one more source, just to. This is source 4 at the top of page 3. And just to finish, I've got a few minutes left. So this is Rav Moshe Feinstein in his Ikrush Moshe asking, this is whether it's permitted to eat or do porging in a place where it's not the tradition. Again, we'll see if this follows on from Chaim Ozer Grudzinski. And what do we do now? Let's say that we've spoken about in Israel because it is done there. What if an expert does it here? Could you eat that meat? And he says as follows, this is source 4, there's one line just framing the question, then the main paragraph. And about the matter that you ask, this is a responsum, where there is a need to porge the hindquarters. He doesn't explain what that situation is. There's also an expert who has, not only he has to be an expert, he has to have a written certificate from another expert rabbi that he is an expert. I don't see a problem. Even though in our places the tradition, or we don't, it doesn't say, we don't have the practice to porch the hindquarters. Lo nimtza shehu minhag shenago le'ezeh chumrah. This is not because they practice this is not because they've made an explicit minhag. Sharak mishum shatabacham le'rotzah tapa b'zeh b'doros achronim. Mainly, he says where he's writing that the butchers didn't want to invest into what she said would be a tircha maruba and tremendous amount of work. And they didn't have a need because we were able to sell that meat off to the non-kosher market. So he's pointing out that if you have a place that in Chutz La'aretz that has, and I believe, a place like, well, actually, it's probably the tradition because I think the other place in the world where you can get is in Buenos Aires, because in South America, certainly in Argentina, there's a lot of beef there. Apparently, it's very good beef there. But you can get beef that has been pork. You can have hindquarters that pork. But he said, Ramosha Feinstein, that even if you live in a city where it's not normally done, but it's done by a world expert, then you could eat from it. And we don't have that case here, but certainly we can extrapolate that to use if we are in Israel or in Buenos Aires, and it's a well-established kashrus authority that your local Orthodox rabbi says is reliable, then you could eat the hindquarters of that. But to bring it back, sadly, is not an option in the UK, unless Shimon tells me I've got this all wrong. But Shimon, have you got anything to add?
It's an interesting question, which I posed to Dan Gelly. In the Baranat School of Robotics, they are looking at using robots to if it would be exact, what would then be the halachic position?
So I can tell you one thing. Is it action? Are they designing it or it's already ready? So Dan Gelly has told me before, based on this is the psak of the Nodi B'Yehuda, that you can only paskin a shaila when it's in front of you. He says because for two reasons. Number one, things change, so you can give. I think I might have mentioned this a few weeks ago because this question has come up. That I asked him a number of years ago. It's not all my questions were about meat, but I did ask him about lab-grown meat, and I asked him the question because I was giving a share on it, and he said, "Wait, when it's a reality, we'll paskin on it, whether it's parav, whether it's meaty, whether it's kosher, whether it's not kosher." And he says for two reasons. Number one, you only have this siyata tishmaya to paskin on something when it's relevant, but also things change. Things change. And a week later, there was an article in the paper that said that those people who were designing lab-grown meat had now changed the use of the medium that they were growing it. It was a blood-based one, and they moved it to a synthetic one. So automatically, part of the shaila changed. So you'll when it's a reality, you will then ask Dan Gelly the question again.
Well, you mentioned forging the forequarters of an animal.
Yeah.
So I missed what's the point of doing that if you're only worried about the hindquarters?
No, because there are forbidden fat. That there are forbidden fats, particularly under the liver, but also there are blood vessels. You also need to porch blood vessels in the forequarters before you can kasher the meat.
That they do here as well.
That they do here. It's much less labor intensive and much less complex in the forequarters than it is in the hindquarters. So yes, absolutely. Otherwise, you couldn't eat the meat.
So another,
Yeah.
if in this country, God forbid, they make it difficult to do it or not cost effective to sell on meat or because it has to be labelled or some other, then would you revisit and you see a scenario where
I imagine the question will be asked again, but it's let's not get to that situation. Shimon should be well and healthy and keep defending Shrita in this country. But if we get to that situation, the question will be asked. I don't know how it will go because there are financial implications and there are serious halachic implications as well. To do it on scale, when, as Shimon has explained to me before, when you have many of the shilas that you talk about, Shrita and kashrus, you're talking about in a pre-industrialized world, and you're talking how many animals were shechted a year, how many. So the questions are fairly straightforward, and that's why. Conversely, you also see that in halacha that you've got someone brings their chicken to the Rov, you can't just go back to the local butcher and get one. Not many chicken shechted, or a cow, and it's got a shiloh. So you've got questions of hefsa maruba, how much of a loss is this, and real difficult questions, because those questions were in a different world. Now we live in an industrialized world where shechita is done on a mass scale, and how do you oversee the trade, the porging of something? So that will obviously be part of the mix when the question is re-asked.
They do that in some places now.
Yeah, I don't know what scale they do it on. But here they do that, but the question is, on what scale do they do it? Because here you do it on 2 or 3 animals, don't you?